Hello. Welcome back, those of you who already know me. For those of you who don't, my name is Steve Tinney, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Penn Museum. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the 2018-2019 Great Series, Great Stuff, both for those returning and to those who are joining us for the first time. In this year's series, we will explore many different aspects of the great stuff that is in this building. How it got here, how we take care of it, how we analyze it, and much, much more. The next lecture in our series is on Wednesday, November 7th, and features Brian Daniels, Director of Research and Programs of the Penn Cultural Heritage Centre, who will speak about protecting stuff today, cultural heritage sites, and the Penn Museum. Now, before I introduce Julian and he begins his presentation about his own favourite objects, I'd like to mention a fantastic new series we've just launched called The Daily Dig. The Daily Dig takes place, anybody want to guess? Every day we're open, yes, at 1 o'clock, 1 in the afternoon. It's a 15-minute talk and allows you to dig deeper into the story of one specific object, featuring a new object every day. You can visit penn.museum/thedailydig, all one word, for a listing of specific objects to be highlighted each day. One other quick program note, a reminder for some of you I know, after the talk there will be time for some questions which will be moderated by our speaker. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and Tina, raising her own hand, will come around with the microphone so everybody can hear. And so to our speaker. It gives me enormous pleasure to be able to introduce to you today our director and friend, Julian Siggers. Even if I must confess to just the merest twinge of regret that I am not introducing him at one of our previous season's great beasts. For Julian is himself a hybrid, both archaeologist and museum person. His first calling, archaeology, prepared him perfectly for his position here because it took him on excavations in England, France, Israel, and Jordan. His great archaeological fascination is the Neolithic, when everything changed. This led him to do both a BA and an MA at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, specialising as he progressed in prehistoric archaeology. He followed this with a PhD at the University of Toronto, writing his dissertation on the lithic assemblage from Tapagat al-Puma, a late Neolithic site in Wadi Ziklab. He co-published several articles on the Wadi Ziklab material and taught archaeology in Toronto and in France. But apparently, this was not enough. In his second life, Julian has become the consummate museum person. He came to the Penn Museum from the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada, where he was Vice President of Programs, Education and Content Communication. He also served as Director of the Institute for Contemporary Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum and as Head of Narrative and Broadcast Development at the United Kingdom's National Museum of Science and Industry in London. Here at the Penn Museum, however, you know Julian best as the Williams Director, a position which he took up in 2012. Since then, he has established himself within our museum community across the Penn campus and as an active member of the American Association of Museum Directors as an outstanding leader of this institution. His clarity of vision is what set us on this path of the massive upgrade to our infrastructure and galleries, which goes under the name Building Transformation. It is characteristic of Julian's enthusiasm for the museum, its membership, and its public that he did not hesitate for a second when we asked him to be the kick-off speaker for this year's Greats Lectures. And so I would like you to join me now in welcoming Julian to the stage to share with us the director's highlights of the Penn Museum collection. Julian.
Thank you very much, Steve, and a warm welcome to the Penn Museum. Museum directors are prone to hyperbole when it comes to talking about their own collections, and I'm afraid I'm no exception. But in this case, I really think I'm justified. This collection is one of the greatest archaeological collections anywhere in the world. And one way to underscore that would be to look at this volume here. Now, I think about 10 years ago, the British Museum did a radio series and a subsequent book called History of the World in 100 Objects. The Smithsonian then wanted to do the same, but with 1,000. And they came to our museum, spent about 2 weeks here photographing our objects, but they also went to the Met and to Cleveland and MFA Boston and the BM. And we really had no idea how many of our objects would make it into this publication to essentially tell the human story. So when the book arrived, the first page was, of course, a very famous bull-headed lyre, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then, as we began counting, we found that 213 of these 1,000 objects were actually from our museum, which was an amazing testimony. And I know it's wrong, but I do take some pleasure in having more than the British Museum. It wasn't just some of the more obvious collections that they actually used. They actually used many objects from the Americas and our African and Asian collections as well. But it's been a really great testimony to what we have. I mean, we have known about how important this collection is for decades. The museum has been around for over 130 years. So coming up with this list of my favorite objects was extremely difficult. And I'm afraid my choice, some of them have been predictable, but some of them are fairly idiosyncratic. And the reason for that is I change my mind all the time. But there is one that I think I have to start off with, and that, of course, is the ram in the thicket from the famous site of that we excavated in the British Museum, with the British Museum, rather, under the leadership of Leonard Woolley. This is one of the great masterpieces of the ancient world, and I have a personal connection to it because when I was a teenager and becoming interested in archaeology, my parents gave me a book called Gods, Graves and Scholars, which some of you may have read. It's great. It's a popular book on the great digs of the past, and two of them were Penn digs. One was to Carl, of course the other was So that's when I first saw it. And then I saw it again as a first-year undergraduate in a course called History of the Ancient World, compulsory course. A room a bit like this one, except I'm so old you could actually smoke. And I was contributing to the fug, and through this sort of silver mist of smoke, up came the ram in the thicket, and that's when I first saw University Museum, Philadelphia. And so to me, it's always had a special place. I actually think this is the most important piece of ancient art in America. I certainly think it's the most important piece of art, writ large, in Philadelphia. Now, my good friend and colleague, Timothy Rubb, at the PMA will probably have something to say about that, and eventually one of his Duchamps, no doubt. But I really think this is spectacular. I mean, you can see the early date made of gold, ivory, lapis lazuli, and silver. There were two found in the Royal Cemetery, and the other has pride of place in the British Museum. So it was with particular pleasure that the first of our new signature galleries that opened were on the ancient Middle East, and we could give this objects and many of the other objects from the city of the rightful display that they should have, with the state-of-the-art lighting to go with it. Peeking behind him, you can see the bull-headed lyre, and here's a close-up of him. But he really is at the top of my list, closely followed by the bull-headed lyre here, who, of course, is also wonderful. Now, he's situated in the second gallery, the Zeltz Gallery, which tells the story of this gallery is about a journey to the city, how we went from farmers to becoming urban dwellers, and of course, that's the situation we now are in. Now, I have another bias in that I'm a Near Eastern archaeologist, so I am drawn to objects from the Near East, but not exclusively. And this is one of my favorite objects too, this winged genie relief from the site of Nimrud, excavated by Layard in the the 1840s. Now, this comes from the palace, and there were many of these genies that surrounded the palace. And the genie was an individual who gave civilization to people, all of the things that made civilization worthwhile, although somebody rather uncharitably pointed out the other day that he appears to be holding a handbag. It's been in the museum for quite a while. When Layard first showed the public the objects from Nimrud, it was an absolute sensation. He brought back the two huge winged bulls that you see on the first floor of the British Museum, the lamassu. And in many ways, the objects from this site are one of the things that prompted the explosion of interest in archaeology to begin with. On a sadder note, and something you'll hear about if you come to the next lecture in this series, this is one of the sites that ISIS did some of the most egregious damage to. In fact, you see them in a video breaking one of these reliefs up, and it caused us enormous distress. But I'll touch on that a little bit later. I was determined to give him to a really great sightline, and the curators, under the direction actually of Steve as head curator, have this wonderful sightline of him as you turn out of the ore galleries. There he is in all his magnificence. So I'm going to stay with Stele and talk about this object here, which is called a very unglamorous name of Stele 14, and it's from Piedras Negras in Guatemala. And it, in fact, is very important to the study of Mayan archaeology and also of this museum. Now, here it is in the ground in the 1930s. And of course, one of the great things about this museum is the bulk of material that's in here, we've excavated ourselves. So we have all the contextual information. And every object, when it comes into the museum, poses a problem. You know, they're all different, they all come with their own challenges. You know, a friend of mine once said about another friend of ours who's very difficult, nothing comes through the front door with that guy. Well, nothing actually comes through the front door in the museum either. So here it is in 1933, coming in through one of the side windows. But there's another really important part to this story, and this is a remarkable woman, Tatiana Proskorokov. And she came to the States and settled in Philadelphia in 1915. She was working for the Tsar, and she gets caught out by the revolution. And she's an architect by training. And she discovers the museum and starts working here. And she actually plays this pivotal role in deciphering Mayan glyphs. Nobody could actually read Mayan glyphs, but it's her early work on them that enabled us to do it. And we now have an epigrapher here called Simon Martin, who is about to publish the world's first encyclopedia of Mayan glyphs. And he very much says that it came from this woman's work. And there actually is a blue plaque outside her house now in Philadelphia, which is great. So the galleries of Mexico and Central America are one of the next new sets of galleries to open. They will be opening this time next year. So obviously we really want you to come and see them. And some of these Stele, including Stele 14, will have an absolute pride of place in the galleries. It's the one over there in the corner. So now on to something a bit more what would appear to be quotidian. And this is a Clovis point, so it's about 4 inches long. But it's an incredibly special point. It's made out of chert. It's dated to around 9000 BCE, but it tells this really amazing story. So at around 12,000 years ago, we're still essentially in the Ice Age, and the seas, because of that, are much, much lower. So much of the world's water is caught up in these ice sheets. And at that time, there's a land bridge between essentially the old world and Alaska. And through that bridge migrates a series of people. And they come down the coast, and they come down an ice-free corridor. And they are expert hunters. And they diffuse out throughout all of America and the Americas. And the distinguishing thing that they have is this very distinctive point. And it is almost the high point of stone tool making. It's incredibly hard to replicate these. And they used it for hunting megafauna. So these are things like mammoths and mastodons. Now, these animals go extinct, probably to do with the climate warming up, but it may also have quite a lot to do with overhunting from the Clovis people. So the point is actually what the people are actually named for. And in fact, 80% of Native Americans today, from DNA studies, have Clovis genes in them. And stone tools get kind of a poor rap here at the museum. They're much more into sort of later periods, but I love stone tools. And they are very, very hard to make. And you may have been wondering why I've got a chunk of rock here. Well, I'll show you how they're made. So stone tools are made using direct percussion, which is hitting a rock with another rock at a very precise angle to flake it off. So this is a piece of chert, which is very similar to the rock that the Clovis people would use. So flint, in fact, is a type of chert. And if you hit it at exactly the right angle, obviously don't do this at home, you can produce a flake. So I put you through. And so that's called a flake, and that's basically the starting block of all stone tools. Now, we've been using stone tools for over 2 million years. And so in many ways, the human story is a story of stone tools getting progressively more complex. And you can reshape them into arrowheads, scrapers, boring tools, a whole range of saws. And of course, they managed to get these incredibly thin flakes, which they could turn into these very, very effective spear points. And we have the added bonus was the archaeologist who named this people and named these points was a Penn archaeologist. Now, here's an object that's also in the Middle East Gallery that's very dear to Steve Tinney's heart. I mean, as you know, we have an amazing collection of Sumerian tablets in this museum. In fact, when it comes to the literary tablets, the tablets that aren't just about numbers and accounting, but about text, this is the best collection in the world. And this is my favorite tablet. And it's from Nippur, which is the first site we excavated in what's now Iraq. And it's called the Babylonian Flood Tablet. And what it contains is the earliest account of the biblical flood that's in Genesis. But it's different, but there are many similarities. And so in this account, as opposed to the gods being annoyed with people, the gods are really annoyed with them. They find them particularly noisy and send a great flood to wipe out humanity. But one of the gods takes the pity of basically a Sumerian Noah and tips him off. And he builds a boat, and unlike in the flood account in Genesis, where all animals are taken in the Sumerian account, it's only domesticated animals. And after a while, the flood abates. So this must be a myth that's common throughout the whole region. And as I say, this is the earliest one that we have. And interestingly, there is some pretty good evidence that there was a dramatic flood in this area. So if you look at this slide here, this is the Great Trench that was excavated at the site of Ur, not that far from Nippur. And so that entire depth is all human occupation. And at the bottom, Woolley found this thick layer of alluvial mud, which is what you get from if you had a huge flood there. And so it is quite possible that the region did experience a very big flood that actually then seeped into the common consciousness of the whole region. So again, back to the sort of more everyday, quotidian, but seemingly so, I have this bowl here made of obsidian from the site of Tepe Gara in Iraq. It's around 6,000 years old. So I wonder, sir, if you could pass that around. So that's a piece of obsidian. I blunted it, but be careful with it. And obsidian is volcanic glass, and it was another type of stone that was used to make stone tools. Now, it is incredibly sharp when you make flakes like I just did there. In some instances, it's actually used in eye surgery. The blade is so sharp. It's sharper than a scalpel. And this bowl, 6,000 years ago, is made for obsidian. And why it intrigues me so much is I just don't know how it's made. This is a stone tool using culture. Essentially, at this point, it's just a small town, more or less a large village. But we're seeing social differentiation. In other words, some people are actually more equal than others. And so in the tombs, we're beginning to see what are seen as luxury goods, and this bowl is one of them. I've never seen anyone like it, and somehow this must have been ground into shape. And I just don't know how, because it is so symmetrical. Now, obsidian is quite hard on the Mohs scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being diamond and 1 being talc. This is around 6 or 7. But it still would have taken hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of just manually scraping it into shape. So have a look at that when it's in the gallery. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. So this is a site of Tepe Gara. Like so many of these sites, it's a tell site, which is layer upon layer of human occupation that builds up over time. So alongside the Mexico and Central American galleries next year, the other set of galleries we're opening up is our new, completely rethought African galleries. And we have a very large collection of African objects, around 30,000 objects. But unlike our other collections, most of this was acquired through purchase or donation. But one of the things we do have is this amazing collection of Benin bronzes, and this is one of my favorite here. But people are very aware of Benin bronzes, but what they may not know about is how these objects were actually displayed in very elaborate circumstances, often with these ivory tusks, which basically tell a story as you go around them. And we're fortunate to have a curator, Tukufu Zubiri, who's redesigning our African galleries. So that's what they look like actually in Benin. This is the altar of the Oba, or the king. And this is just a very cursory look at what these galleries would look like. But we're not actually going to shy away from the context of these objects. I mean, some of these objects, were collected in the colonial context, so these are issues that we would like to discuss in these galleries, but the Benin bronzes definitely make it onto my list. Not surprising, I have a great affinity to our Egyptian collection, and this is a favorite of mine. It's another stele, but it's really interesting because it's not from Egypt. It's actually from the site of Beit Shan, which is in Israel. And at one point, Beit Shan was an Egyptian fort, an administrative center. And it also has this old rogue here, Ramses. He's on the right, talking to Amun-Ra. And so basically, this is him giving tribute, and at the bottom are all his enemies down there. And even though it's Egyptian, it's made on Jordanian stone. But Ramses was a master of propaganda. He put his face absolutely everywhere. And if you look in our gallery, we have many Ramses II statues. The big seated pharaoh in the center, that's Ramses II. In fact, on that one, he carves his face on other people's statues. So he's not even content with making new ones. But this has always been a great, you can see it in Upper Egypt right now. So that's what Beit Shan looked like when Clarence Fisher went there in the 20s. Now, if you go to Israel, it's a wonderful site for tourists. In fact, they've exposed the entire Roman area there, which is where we're standing. So here is like an amphitheater and Roman columns, but at the top it was Byzantine, at the bottom it was Stone Age. It was a Hellenistic town, it was a Roman town, and it was Egyptian, and at the top Byzantine. I've always been very taken by the civilization around Palmyra in Syria. And this is a Palmyrene statue that's on display actually in our Roman gallery. And they were great traders. They were on the Silk Route. And you can see in this statue the Eastern and Roman influences in it. But the real reason I like it is because there are many statues like this of noble women. And there was one particularly famous one called Queen Zenobia. And she's been represented in many different by artists over time. But Queen Zenobia was one of the great queens of the ancient world. And there are a number of descriptions of it, and they always seem to match these women. Is that they have strong features, they are beautiful, but essentially they have a stare that will melt you to the ground if you cross them. And I can really see that in her. And unfortunately, this was the other area that ISIS really desecrated, was the city of Palmyra. So right now we have an exhibition that's on through November the 25th called Cultures in the Crossfire. And this charts the work of what Brian Daniels and the Cultural Heritage Centre does. And I urge you to see it before it comes down. I have a real passion for ancient armour, which is unfortunate because there's very little of it. It's one of the first things to decay. It's not like stone or pottery, so there's very little. But we're very fortunate here at the Penn Museum to have one of the finest suits of Etruscan armour. So this is the Nasa helmet from Italy, just before the Romans, about 700 BCE. And we are lucky to have this, and the reason why we do is because the Etruscans would bury objects in stone tombs, so a bit like the Egyptians, and so they have a much better chance of surviving. But I love this helmet. I mean, all warriors are peacocks in a way. And so, I mean, this crest over here is the most impractical thing you can have on a helmet, because it's just another place for you to get dinged and to twist your head around. But we have a number of pieces of this armor actually from the very same tomb. And this is a Etruscan tomb a few hundred years later, but it gives you an idea of how decorated some of them were. And of course, the preservation within the tomb was really, really good. Many of you here are members of the museum, and so would have got the latest copy of Expedition. And Jane Hickman, who's the editor of Expedition, said, like, I'm going to do a piece on ancient coins. And I must admit, I was like, really? But she's produced the most fascinating article on how to interpret ancient coins. And coins are very special to archaeologists, because if we find them on a dig in a layer, we can often date that coin. And when you date the coin, you can date the layer. So there's great celebration on an archaeological site when you find coins. This article tells you how to interpret them. Now, the earliest coins are actually in Turkey, but the Greeks are pretty close behind. And this is one of the earliest Greek coins. And I just love it for the simplicity of that turtle. I think it's just the most beautiful piece. It's in the Greek gallery. It's tiny, but it is absolutely stunning. And so in a similar vein, also in the Greek Valley, are these fingers made of marble. And so they are 3 times life size. So they would have come from a statue that would have been around 15 feet. And what's intriguing about this is they come, even though they're Roman, they come from the Roman lair of Beit Shan. And we know that the Roman town there had a colossal statue of Augustus. And so we think that this must be from the colossal statue, and this is all that remains. I always find that tantalizing about archaeology, the fragmentary nature of it. So here's Augustus. He was a bit like Ramses II. He had his picture everywhere, and frankly, nobody has hair that good. during the day, particularly after like a troublesome finance meeting or something like that, I tend to wander the galleries. And one of my favorite objects to look at is this Lohan statue from China. So he's slightly bigger than life size. Now, he is a Buddhist monk, very hard to date, somewhere between the 10th and the 13th century. Now, there are very, very few of these. There's one at the Met, there's one in the Royal Ontario Museum, there's one at the Nelson Atkins Museum. But I'm told that this is the most spectacular one. And I find just looking at him sort of calms me down. It's a very serene but purposeful face. So he is definitely my favorite object in the Chinese collection. I don't suppose you can have one of these best of things without putting in some bling. So some of you may have seen our Beneath the Surface exhibition a few years ago about our excavations at Sitio Conte. This was a remarkable show, and it highlights the work of our excavations there under the aegis of Alden Mason. But I have a particular mean-spirited affection for this site because we were actually digging it together with the Harvard Peabody. And they packed it in. We were just finding houses, and then we hit this cemetery that was packed full of gold, and they had left. And this came from the grave of a chieftain who was obviously enormously important. There, he had huge gold plaques on his chest, and he had this around his neck, and it is in fact a gold jaguar, but the emerald that's in the middle there is about 1.5 inches long. So that is an extremely large gemstone, obviously before the time of faceting, but he's always been an absolute favorite of mine. So I alluded to the great plans afoot here. So next year we open the Africa galleries, Mexico and Central America. We also open a completely refurbished first floor in Harrison Auditorium, which is where these lectures usually are. But we are now hard at work on the Egyptian galleries. We're using the same designers we used for the Middle East galleries. And I often talk about how spectacular these galleries are going to be, and I mention the fact that, you know, at its heart, there's going to be the only Egyptian palace on display at full height outside of Egypt. But there is another absolute gem that is going to be on display in its entirety for the first time, and that is the tomb chapel of Kai-Pera. And it's from the Old Kingdom. So when it comes to empires, nothing comes close to Egypt. If you look at the Romans, maybe 700 years, Brits, if you're generous, 250, 5,000 years the Egyptians had. And this is right at the beginning. Now, this chapel came to us in strange circumstances, but there is so little Old Kingdom material anywhere. If you go to the Grand Museum in Cairo, and you'll see just a maze of Egyptian material, maybe 5% of that is Old Kingdom. And we have this whole chapel. So basically, the chapels were built on top of a tomb for priests to continue to pray for the deceased, and there are spells and there are incantations around it. So this is over 4,000 years old, and it's in the most remarkable condition. So here it is being excavated at Saqqara, which is also the area where many pyramids are, just outside of Cairo. And it was purchased in Egypt, and it came to the US, to the St. Louis Exposition in 1904, where it was seen by the wealthy Philadelphian John Wanamaker, who purchased it for us and gave it to us. And so it's been on display in parts, but we are going to build the whole rectangle and have it on display in Lower Egypt. So Lower Egypt will tell the story of the dead and daily life, and Upper Egypt, the kings and the gods. But if you look at this carefully, I mean, you can see the original pigment is still on there after over 4,000 years. Amazing. I mean, look at the quality of that. So right now it's being conserved and it's being got ready essentially for display in a couple of years' time. And we've taken it apart in different pieces. Every piece is meticulously cleaned. And unfortunately, when we were in Lower Egypt taking everything down to go to storage to be conserved, many of these objects have been put up around 100 years ago. And so there are actually no records of how they were. And so our conservators, it was a bit of a guessing game. But eventually they will be shown right here in Lower Egypt. There you can see our Sphinx. There are a number of side galleries, and then above that, we will have the palace itself. And this is Haley Sharp's just very rough estimation of a possible layout of what the palace could look like. But it's going to be absolutely spectacular. It's my hope that this actually will be the most dramatic gallery anywhere in the United States, and it will be right here in Philadelphia, as it should be. It's a wonderful 100-year arc story, because this came to the museum 100 years ago next year. And the director at the time made a mistake with the loading of the floor. And the ceilings were always intended for it, but the floor could never hold it. And we have worked with the specialist in this kind of Guastavino architecture to find a solution, and we'll do it. So one of the great things about this new renovation is it's going to allow us not only to retell these stories with modern relevance and in a modern context, but also to display a great deal more of our objects than we previously have had to do. So I can't think of a more exciting time to be here, although I do apologize for the inconvenience of getting around this museum here. So, a collection that tells essentially the whole of our story, a story that we're all related to. And it's always amazed me just the speed in which humans have collected objects. So for the Clovis people, a Clovis individual would be able to have his entire possessions on a small table in front of them. When I moved here to Philadelphia with my wife, and it's just us and a bad dog, we filled an entire shipping container of stuff that we probably don't need. And yet we are a museum of it. But before I throw the floor open to some questions, I would be very grateful if you all thought about what your favorite objects are. You could send them to me at that email address there. It's director@pennmuseum.org. It's on the website. But we're always curious about, what our audience thinks of our objects. I mean, I've had some incredibly interesting conversations with people in galleries about why they like a particular object. So do send them in. So thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope you come to the rest of our series.
I see one over here.
LIDAR, or however you say it, is exposing huge amounts of the Mayan civilization. What are the new rules about when you can take it out and where you can take it to? Because obviously that's going to start to be explored.
Right.
We can't just take things and take them back to the United States the way we used to. But what are the rules now?
Well, basically, the time when you would actually bring objects back to a museum like this one are long gone. So objects stopped leaving their country of origin, depending on the country you were in, sort of from the 50s to the 60s. And so really now we are excavating for scientific inquiry. We sometimes bring back objects to study here, but they get returned to the country of origin. But in the old days, we had what was called the partage system, which was, say we were excavating in Iraq. So take for example. A quarter of the objects went to the British Museum, a quarter of the objects went to Penn, and half stayed in Baghdad. That's how it used to work, and it was basically a negotiation with the country of origin, which is why you could never create a museum like this one.
How do you determine which objects will be displayed and which will be kept in storage?
That's a very, very good question. What we're trying to do in these galleries is tell a story. We're trying to, it's an extremely complicated process of how you develop a gallery. So for the Middle Eastern galleries, there are 10 curators, and the conversations they have with the designers can take about a year. And then it's, what objects do you have that will best tell this story? And then you select the objects because of that. Having said that, when you have really spectacular stuff, you really want to get it out as well. So that can tip your hand a bit.
I'm wondering if any of the objects that are here are being requested to be returned to their place of origin.
Again, a very good, very timely question as well. The number one objects that are returned are human remains of North American individuals. So we have an office here called the NAGPRA office who does nothing but looks for Native American groups who these human remains may belong to, and we proactively return them. Having said that, we do get requests from other countries who will challenge the authenticity of how we have them. But compared to museums, like the Met, we don't usually have much of a problem with that because we have all of the archives. We excavated it ourselves, so we have really, really good documentation of how we acquired them. But we were in Egypt on a tour of one of our excavations there, and the new Egyptian Minister of Culture, they all know about this collection here. And frankly, they were thrilled that there are Egyptian collections all over the world now, because that's what's going to draw people. It's what's going to spark a fascination with their culture.
How many conservators does Penn have now during this transformation process, and how many hours have they put in already?
Oh, well,
Estimate.
we have new conservation labs here in the West Wing, and there's a set conservation staff of like 3 or 4, but in fact on a project like this we're going to go up to about 14. So right now we've removed much of the collection off-site to another storage place, a place with a lot of room where all of these conservators can, essentially get to work. Because they're the people that advise us on, how we can reconstruct them, what we need to do to actually preserve them as well. So 13 to 14 right now, and they've been working on this for at least 4 years already. So, yeah, they often make some of the most interesting discoveries, actually.
How old does something have to be to qualify for your collection?
In the 1930s, the individual who was director of this museum was also, like now, great friends of the director of the PMA. And they had a gentleman's agreement that we would stop collecting in the late antique. So, in the 10th century, something like that. However, we've both broken that. So we have Chinese material that's only a few hundred years old. They have material that's fairly old too. But there was a big exchange of items between the two museums, and we worked together very closely. But that around the late antique is when we sort of stopped. Yeah. It's over there in the corner, actually.
Do you know if any of those conservators are on cue to do talks as part of this lecture series?
Yes. You know what they are on cue to? They would be doing some of those daily dig things. So, I mean, I would check out from the website when they're on, and because they have the most amazing stories to tell. So,
Lynn Grant will be speaking in their December lecture.
asked and answered. So,
And the open window in the Artifact Lab daily.
and of course, we have an on-the-floor artifacts lab on the 3rd floor, and you can see them working. And at certain points, they'll open the window, and you can ask them questions.
Thank you. So you had mentioned that a lot of the artifacts, as in most museums, aren't actually on display. Is there a reason, is it just too hard logistically to send those artifacts to other museums or other institutions that could view them? Because it seems like we miss out on seeing a lot of things just because every institution has so many.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true. Most museums have between 3 and 5% of their stuff on display. There are a couple of things that are sort of caveats to that. A lot of that stuff may not be that great. I mean, it could be sort of stuff that's fairly, and the other thing is particularly with a museum like that museum is always accessible. People can request to go and see it and study it. I mean, that's one of the purposes of a university museum. And it's also one of the reasons why this museum has had a real drive to digitize its collections. So we have around 1 million objects, about 700,000 of them are now online. And so we noticed enormous traffic that goes straight into the digital collections, because that is one way of sharing them. It's also a way of letting people know what's here. And the other thing we do is we loan objects to other museums all the time. So that's another way. It may not be seen right now here, but it can be seen in other places. Yeah. That's it. Well, thank you very much for coming tonight.